Gather round and welcome back to this very special edition of the 5 Thoughts on This Week in College Football. First round playoff edition, folks. That's right. We had the first round of the college football playoff behind us Friday and Saturday, and it was exciting in some ways and absolutely lackluster in other ways. So we're going to break into that here in the 5 Thoughts. We also got a crowning of the Division II National Championship, and that is the same team as it was last year. We'll talk a little bit about that, and we also will get into a little bit on D3 here, the Johns. That's right, John Carroll and Johns Hopkins couldn't get it done this week in the semifinal games there, the D3 playoffs, and we're going to break down a little bit on what happened there. So let's sit back and enjoy the next 20 minutes of your life here as we break down the first week of the college football playoff. Thought 1 on this week in college football. Let's move down to Norman, Oklahoma. That's right, the Sooners welcomed in the Alabama Crimson Tide to this playoff game, and this line bounced around back and forth from Alabama plus or minus 1.5 to kick off Oklahoma giving like 1.5, and it was just a pick'em game all the way around. We really thought this was going to be probably a defensive struggle, much like what we saw in the first matchup. It ended up like 23-21 a few weeks ago there in T-Town. That's Tuscaloosa for all you non-Alabama people. But anyways, this game ended up being 17-0 halfway through the second quarter, and the Oklahoma Sooners just looked like they were absolutely going to whip Alabama in this football game. Alabama ended up coming down the field, making a nice run, about 7 minutes or so to go in the second quarter. They get down at 4th and 2 inside the 10-yard line. Alabama, instead of kicking a field goal to make it 17-3, they end up getting a touchdown here on the 4th and 2 play, and then cutting this lead from 17-0 to 17-7. Oklahoma comes out on the next drive, 3rd and 3 play, and it was just shy of midfield there for Oklahoma. 3rd and 3, John Mateer gets the pressure, gets out of the pressure, rolls to his left. He has a receiver, I would say, pretty damn wide open down the field, but he also has about 20 yards of running space here that he could pick up. As Woody Hayes often said, only 3 things can happen when you pass the football, and 2 of them are bad. And John Mateer unleashed a rocket down the field, and it just came short of being caught, hit the receiver in the hands, but he couldn't maintain the ball. They ended up having to go to 4th down. Now, why is this so important? Because if John Mateer would have just ran that ball, he had about at least a solid 10, 15, maybe 20 yards of green grass ahead of him. It was 3rd and 3 here, folks, and they didn't really need a big play at this point, although if the kid would have caught the ball, he probably would have scored a touchdown. But at the end of the day, they needed to pick up the 3 yards, get a first down, and move the chains and convert a score on this drive. But instead, they had to punt here at 4th and 3. And of course, what do we get? We get a fumble, Ruski snap, and I don't know what the kicker was doing. It looked like he almost dropped the ball, maybe purposely. I'm not sure, but it just slipped out of his hands, ends up getting blocked by Alabama. Alabama then goes down and punches in the 3 points to cut this thing to 17-10. Oklahoma comes out on the next drive, and boom, it's 17-17 with the pick 6, and it is just looking like hell on earth here for Oklahoma, that considering they were up 17-0 and they needed a 3rd down and 3 conversion to probably put this game away, and they couldn't do it. They get the block punt, they get the pick 6, and next thing you know, this thing is all Alabama on a roll here going into halftime. Alabama comes out, takes it 24-17 on the ensuing drive, or the second drive. I can't remember if it was the first or second drive of the second half. And anyways, we end up with a 34-7 run here for Alabama in the 2.5 quarters to finish this game, winning this football game 34-24. Oklahoma missed a couple kicks, which is unlikely, unfathomable with the kicker that they have and the weapon that he is, but he did miss 2 kicks. It still was only 6 points, and they end up losing by 10. So bottom line here is that Alabama really looked like a pretty solid football team in the second half and partway, like I said, the last 7 minutes or so of the second quarter and all through the second half. We'll see if they can play with that kind of intensity and the way that they played on Friday night on the road at the Rose Bowl when they take on Indiana. It'll be interesting. But again, I really think this game came down to this play where if John Mateer probably runs that ball, picks the first down up, Oklahoma probably takes this ball into scoring position late into the second quarter, racks up another score, and Alabama goes into halftime down 3 scores or maybe even worse. But they didn't, and it's just one of those hindsight 2020s. But in real-time action, I was yelling, run the ball, run the ball, run the ball, because he had so much open space there, and he just needed a first down to keep that drive alive. So bottom line here is Alabama gets it done. It's tough to beat Alabama twice in a year, and it hasn't happened in the last 2 centuries. And here we are again, and it didn't happen again. So we'll see how Alabama looks against Indiana. If they play like they played in the second half, I think they could beat Indiana, but that's a show for another day. Thought 2 on this week in college football. Let's move down to College Station, Texas, and we had what we thought was going to be a historic matchup between Miami and Texas A&M, potentially a score fest in this game, and it ended up for most people what they would consider a snooze fest. It was a defensive struggle, although I don't know that the defenses were great in this game. It could have been that the offenses just weren't clicking very well, and it really boiled down here. This game was 0-0 at halftime. Like the first time there's been a playoff game at 0-0, and who knows, ever probably. But we get into the second half. Miami takes a big punt return there by Malachi Toney, ends up knocking in 3 points, get this thing to 3-0. Texas A&M comes back later on in the game and ties this thing up at 3-3, and we move into the fourth quarter. And then all of a sudden, Fletcher for Miami just started pounding the football, pounding the rock on this late drive in the fourth quarter. They end up, let's move back before that and talk a little bit. They were moving the ball again in the series earlier in the fourth quarter, and Malachi Toney fumbles the ball, giving a potential scoring drive away, giving the ball back to Texas A&M. Then later on in the fourth quarter, we had Fletcher just go bonkers here on the ground with a couple big runs, getting Miami down in the scoring position again there in Texas A&M side. Now, they've already had missed 3 field goals in this game. Partially because of the wind. I think they had 1 blocked. So it just was, very challenging when Miami got into scoring position to get points on the board. So they really needed a touchdown here on this drive, and they give it to the superstar, All-American, super freshman, Malachi Toney. He takes it around the right side in for the touchdown to take this thing to 10-3, but giving Texas A&M just enough time on the clock to try to push the ball down the field and tie this thing up. And what do you think happens? Exactly what we had occur. Again, these 2 drives late in the fourth quarter is where really all the action was in the entire game. The rest of the time, neither team was really moving the ball very well. Miami wasn't moving the ball very well at all. Texas A&M was moving the ball, but costing themselves on penalties. The bottom line here is Texas A&M and Marcel Reed, they get the ball back with, right around 2 minutes to go. They end up driving this thing all the way down to inside the 10-yard line, have an opportunity to tie this game up, comes up to a third down, and Marcel Reed goes ahead and throws behind an open receiver and gets the ball intercepted. Miami ends up winning this football game. So what can we take away from this? How good is Miami's defense? How bad was Texas A&M's offense? Again, this is a team that was only able to put up 3 points here at home against an ACC team, which for all the SEC fans, quite frankly, is quite embarrassing when you lose to an ACC team. That's right. SEC. You lost to an ACC team who you call weak and pathetic, and yet you only can muster 3 points at home for Texas A&M. So bottom line here is Miami wins the game. They're going to take on Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl. We're going to find out if Miami's defense is as good as it looked. Ruben Bain is just an absolute wrecker out there for the Miami defense. Obviously, we got Fletcher at running back and Malachi Toney, two incredibly good football players at the running back and wide receiver position. We'll see. Carson Beck did not have a great game yesterday, but it was good enough to win the football game. We'll see if he can have another he's going to need to have a much better game against Ohio State than he had yesterday. So we'll see where that comes. So at the end of the day, the Miami Hurricanes beat the Texas A&M Aggies in College Station 10-3 in what most people called a snooze fest, but I said it was an interesting game nonetheless. Thought 3 on this week in college football. Well, let's combine this next thought on the two group of 5 teams in the college football playoff. That's right. We had Tulane travel to Ole Miss, and they took a beat down 41-3. And Ole Miss in this instance really had no problem moving the ball. The first 2 drives were absolutely incredible. Took a 14. I think the first drive was 5 yards, 75 yards, or 5 plays, 75 yards to score a touchdown. The next one took 3 or 4 plays again to score. And this game was pretty much over after the first 2 drives. It was honestly over after the first drive. Jake Resloff couldn't really get anything going there for Tulane offensively. And it did look a little scary there late in the second quarter when we had Trinidad Chambliss and we had Keywan Lacey both go out with injuries late in the second quarter, but they did come back in the third quarter and took care of business there. So Ole Miss had no trouble dismantling Tulane. We then moved up to Autzen Stadium in Oregon. We had JMU in Oregon battling off on Saturday night. And again, this game started off much like the Ole Miss game. Oregon just went boom, boom, boom down the field and scored on the first possession. James Madison had a good drive on their first possession. It was about 63 yards or so. But the bottom line at the end of the day, Oregon just way too much for this JMU team in the first half. It was like 34-3 or something at the end of the first half. It ended up being 51-34. James Madison ended up in the second half making some plays, and I don't think I want to say they made it interesting, but they definitely cut the score. They got over 500 yards against Oregon. The thing about it is Oregon played like 30 defenders in this game. 22 of them ended up with tackles, so that's too deep right there in your on your defensive side that played in this game. So I'm not going to put much about anything with JMU scoring 31 points and getting over 34 points, I think, and getting over 500 yards of offense. It all came late against backups, and really, at the end of the day, Oregon controlled this game every which way but loose. So the question is, we should never have 2 G5 schools in the playoffs again. It's obvious we need to have either a G5 playoff or a maximum of 1 team. The best G5 can't beat any of these Power 4 schools in the playoffs. Yes, they can in the regular season because you can catch them on a down day, but you're not going to catch these teams on a down day in the playoffs when they have 2 or 3 weeks plus to prepare for you. So bottom line here is that the G5 should be held to 1 team at the most. I don't even know that they should get any teams in, but we'll give them 1. Maybe we should have a playoff for the G5 schools, and if they're good enough to be into the big playoff, they can be in, but they can play their own playoff. However we work it out, we can't have what we saw yesterday with 2 games being absolutely lackluster there in the college football playoff. It's one thing to have 1, but 2 is just too many. All right, there we go. G5 don't show up in the playoffs, and Oregon and Ole Miss roll them out of town. Thought 4 on This Week in College Football. Well, let's move over to the FCS. We had the semifinal games here. We had Montana and Montana State in the first game, and we had Villanova hosting Illinois State. If you haven't followed this Illinois State team, folks, it's quite the accomplishment this team's done. But in the first game, Montana State took over this game against Montana, ended up winning it relatively easier. This is a big, big battle for these two schools. They're generally both in the top four of the college football playoffs year in and year out at the FCS level. So absolute great win there for Montana State, and what many people will probably consider to be the actual national championship game in FCS between Montana and Montana State, although Villanova and Illinois State were playing on the other side of the bracket, and Illinois State ends up winning this game against Villanova, and quite the accomplishment here for Illinois State. They have went on the road, and they have beat the number one team in this playoff, and now they've won 4 straight road games here against Villanova, and they've earned their way into the championship game to take on Montana State. I would tell you that this game is probably not going to be super competitive because Montana State is an absolute juggernaut. But with that being said, we saw Illinois State already beat the number one seed in this playoff down here on the one side of the bracket. So anything is possible. It's quite the story there for Illinois State. So we should see an exciting game here in the FCS championship game again. Montana State taking on Illinois State. It's really almost a David versus Goliath battle here, just because Montana State is generally, like I said, one of the better teams in FCS, and Illinois State barely got into playoffs and had to win, all these games on the road to get here. So I expect Montana State to win this game pretty easily, but you got to give it up there to Illinois State for quite the run they've had in the playoffs. So great job, Illinois State. It'll be an exciting, fun game to see play out here in the FCS National Championship. Thought 5 on This Week in College Football. Well, let's move down to the D3 level, and that's right, folks. We had the Johns. That's right, John Carroll and Johns Hopkins University taking on North Central in Wisconsin River Falls. That's right, John Carroll took on North Central. This is the defending national champion in Division III. And then we had Johns Hopkins take on a pretty solid Wisconsin River Falls team. That game was pretty close, 48-41. Wisconsin River Falls pulls it out. The North Central over John Carroll game, this game was 28-0 at halftime there in favor of North Central. John Carroll did end up scoring some points in the second half, making it 41-21. But this is pretty much what we thought going into the season or into the playoff. We would see one of these Wisconsin teams against North Central. And maybe a Mount Union, but Mount Union couldn't get by John Carroll, and I don't think they would have been able to beat North Central this year either. North Central is the dominant player right now in D3, so we got quite the interesting matchup here coming up in D3 between Wisconsin River Falls and North Central, and this game is like on Sunday, I think, January 3rd or 4th, whatever day that we're into. So it should be a very, very interesting game. I think we're going to see North Central win another national title here in this Division III and kind of become the dominant force here in D3. This would be back-to-back national championships, and I think they may even have won another one here in the last few years. So North Central versus Wisconsin River Falls. You got to watch it, folks. D3 is where they play for just money, for scholarships, for academic. There's no athletic scholarships. These kids are just playing for the fun of it. Extra. Well, we did crown some national champions this week in college football, and yesterday we got to see the D2 college football championship game between Harding and Ferris State. Ferris State's the defending national champions. That's right. That's where Trinidad Chambliss, the quarterback at Ole Miss, came from last year. He was the quarterback that won the national championship for Ferris State and then transferred to Ole Miss. This year, new quarterback, same old story. Ferris State wins the Division II national championship over Harding University. We also got to see the National Junior College Championship occur on Wednesday, Thursday night, one of those two nights earlier this week. It must have been on Wednesday night. We saw Western Iowa, that's right, the big program of Western Iowa, come out and win this football game, and they are the national champs in the National Junior College Championship game. So what an exciting thing for those Western Iowa kids. And they might have some good transfers that move into other roles at D2, FCS, and maybe even FBS schools. All right, folks, well, there's the show this week on college football. 5 thoughts in your brain to get you through the week. We've got a lot to discuss coming up, getting into the second round of the college football playoffs. We've got some great potential matchups here between Oregon and Texas Tech. We've got Indiana taking on the big juggernaut Alabama. We got a rematch in the SEC without Lane Kiffin of Ole Miss and Georgia. And then we've got the Miami Hurricanes trying to revenge that 2002 national championship loss against the Ohio State Buckeyes in the Cotton Bowl. So these are just going to be some tremendous games getting into the second round. We'll also have some good bowl games coming up here before we get to our next show, which will be right after the games that occur here on New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And the playoffs will come back on that Friday and get a show out recapping those games. Friday. The Friday after New Year's, that'll be the 2nd. We'll get a show out. So stay tuned for that. It'll be real exciting to talk about those 4 football games. So remember, gather around in ALTT. We'll see you soon.